Hello, everyone. Welcome to the fourth Dandi Iraq meeting. I am Mustafa Murayati, a fifth-year medical student at Baghdad College of Medicine, University of Baghdad. I'm a scientific officer at the Dandi Iraq, and we all would like to welcome you to this meeting. So here in this meeting, we will talk about neuroanatomy. Especially, we have a specific target, the surface anatomy of the brain, the cerebrum surface anatomy. My presentation would be as interactive as possible. So anytime you would like to share or ask a question, please go ahead. And it will all be in English, so it can be recorded and maybe uploaded later on YouTube, you can see. I think this meeting is not only for Dundee members, because this is regarded as the first educational meeting for our Dundee Iraq. So it will be for members and non-members, but the next meeting will be only exclusively for members. So let me start now. The content of my presentation, that we will talk about the sulci and the gyri of the cerebrum. Let's have a basic idea. Now, the brain has sulci and gyri on it. It has appearance like hills and valleys, hills going up and valleys going down. Well, that increases the surface area of the brain. The hills, the gyri, and the sulci represent potential spaces for blood vessels to pass on the surface of the brain. For example, the cerebral cortical arteries, cortical veins, and it's located in the subarachnoid space, so it's filled with the CSF also. Now, going from these very basic concepts of the sulci and gyri, let's see different views of the brain. We have multiple brain views, for example, lateral view, medial view, inferior view, superior view, anterior and posterior views. In each view, I can see different structures. For example, in the lateral view, I can see the sylvian fissure. On the medial view, I can see the corpus callosum. On the inferior view, I can see the olfactory sulcus or the olfactory tract. On the superior view, I can see the longitudinal fissure that separate the two hemispheres, the right and left hemispheres. And we have anterior, we can see the pons from the anterior brainstem, and posteriorly, we can see the cerebellum. So different views, whether it is a cadaveric view or radiological view, we can get orientation to that in the next few minutes. So first of all, let's review the main four lobes of the brain: the frontal, the parietal, occipital, and temporal. The lobes are separated by specific surface landmarks. For example, the frontal lobe here in the yellow is separated by from the parietal lobe by the central sulcus, that we will talk in more details later. And the parietal lobe is separated from the occipital by the parieto-occipital sulcus, and the frontoparietal lobe separated from the temporal lobe by the sylvian fissure. Here are just a few examples about the surface anatomy. Now, we have the fifth lobe of the brain. If you have ever heard about it, it's called the insula. It lies deep within the operculum of the frontoparietal lobe and the temporal lobe. So here, if we retract the frontoparietal lobe superiorly and the temporal lobe inferiorly, we can visualize the sylvian fissure. What's deep in it is the insula, and we will talk about the surface landmarks of the insula later on. This is a cadaveric picture. This is the left hemisphere. This is the orbit, the left orbit, and this is a retractor pulling the frontoparietal lobe upward and the temporal lobe downward, showing this is the insula. This is sometimes regarded as the fifth lobe of the brain. Now let's take an overview about the sulci and gyri on the lateral surface of the brain, or the lateral cortex. Well, I'll just talk about it very fast, and then we will discuss each part in details. So first of all, we have two important sulci on the lateral surface. They are the central sulcus and the sylvian sulcus, or the lateral sulcus. By the way, the central sulcus, also called as Rolando sulcus. So each of them has two names: the Rolando sulcus and the sylvian fissure. Okay, the frontal lobe and the temporal lobe, each of which has 3 gyri and 2 sulci, that separate the gyri of it. We have the superior frontal and inferior frontal sulci, and we have superior temporal and inferior temporal sulcus. And then we have superior frontal gyrus, middle frontal gyrus, and inferior frontal gyrus. So the sulci divide the frontal lobes into superior, middle, and inferior frontal gyrus, just as for the temporal lobe. Regarding the parietal lobe, we have the interparietal sulcus, divide the parietal lobe into superior parietal lobule and inferior parietal lobule. And in the occipital lobe, we have the lateral occipital sulcus, divide the occipital lobe into superior and inferior, and sometimes middle or lateral occipital gyrus. That's a quick recap about how the division of the surface anatomy, how the sulci and gyri will divide the brain into multiple different areas. Starting from the frontal lobe, here in the yellow areas, represent the frontal lobe. Here we have the demarcation of the central sulcus that separate the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. Here we have the Sylvian fissure. The Sylvian fissure or the lateral sulcus has three main components indeed. That's important to keep in mind. It has posterior ramus that goes posteriorly, as we can see here, ends posteriorly and superiorly, and has two anterior components, the anterior ascending ramus and the anterior horizontal ramus. Okay, so this is the anterior ascending and this is the anterior horizontal ramus. Here, the two sulci, the superior frontal sulcus, this is the inferior frontal sulcus, and this is the superior frontal gyrus, middle frontal, and inferior frontal gyrus. So we mentioned that this is the central sulcus. So what's in front of the central sulcus is the precentral, that means in front of the central gyrus, and in front of the precentral gyrus is the precentral sulcus. Well, it's important to know these landmarks on radiology so we can localize the lesions and predict the deficit if this area is lesioned, for example. So now that's for the frontal lobe sulci. One more time, let's imagine this is the highlighted here. This is the central sulcus. In front of it, the red one is the precentral gyrus. Now we have, this is the superior frontal gyrus, middle frontal gyrus, inferior frontal gyrus. And this is the most anterior part of the frontal lobe. It's called the frontal pole. This is in the pink area. And this is the purple area here. This represents the orbital gyrus. So we can imagine the relationship of this part of the brain to the orbit over here. So it's called the orbital gyrus, just above the orbit. Well, the inferior frontal gyrus is divided into three more parts. The pars orbitalis, pars triangularis, and pars opercularis. Each of which has its specific surface landmarks that can tell which part is it. So we mentioned earlier that we have the Sylvian fissure with its two anterior components, the anterior ascending and the anterior horizontal. So as we can see here, the anterior ascending and the anterior horizontal part, creating a triangle-like part, this is that will represent the pars triangularis area. What's in front of it, this is the pars orbitalis, just above the orbit, over here, pars, and this is the pars opercularis, so it's near to the operculum of the frontal lobe. The operculum, I mean the lips at this fissure. This is the Sylvian fissure. So we have the inferior frontal gyrus is divided into pars orbitalis, pars triangularis, and pars opercularis. Now moving to the parietal lobe. This is the parietal lobe, extends from the central sulcus anteriorly to the parieto-occipital sulcus posteriorly. And what's between them is the parietal lobe. We have two important lateral sulci, we can see. We have the interparietal sulcus, so divided into superior and inferior parietal lobule. And we have post-centrally, the sulcus, this is the central sulcus. Behind it, we have the post-central gyrus, and behind the gyrus, we have the post-central sulcus. So just as for the frontal lobe, we have the precentral gyrus and the precentral sulcus, we have the post-central gyrus and the post-central sulcus. This is main somatosensory cortex. And also we can visualize this sulci coming from the medial side of the brain. We will talk about it in the next slides in details. One more time, the gyri of the parietal lobe. This is the post-central gyrus, the purple one. The pink one is the superior parietal lobule. The yellow one is the inferior parietal lobule, separated by the interparietal sulcus. Interparietal sulcus mean what's inter means between. Interparietal means that between the parietal, it will divide the parietal lobe into two parts, superior and inferior. Now, two more things in the parietal lobe to be discussed now. We have two areas, the supramarginal area and the angular area. The supramarginal area is demarcated here in the blue area. It is on the both sides. It occurs on the both side of the sylvian fissure, at the posterior end of the sylvian fissure. While the angular gyrus located at the posterior end of the superior temporal sulcus. So this is the temporal lobe. The red one is the superior temporal sulcus. This is the inferior temporal sulcus. At the end of the superior temporal sulcus, we have the angular gyrus, also related to the parietal lobe, these areas. So the supramarginal and the angular gyrus. Now we will talk about the temporal lobe. Here our friend, the sylvian fissure. This is the posterior ramus, and here is the anterior ascending, and this is the anterior horizontal. This is pars triangularis. This is pars opercularis. This is pars. What? Can you guess? Anyone? I want to hear your voice. Any one of you? What do we call this part?
Pars opercularis.
Excellent. Yes, this is pars opercularis. So one more note to be held in mind. Behind the pars opercularis, it should be the precentral gyrus. So this should be the precentral gyrus. Okay, so this is an important note to keep in mind. We will use it later. So what's behind the precentral gyrus is the central sulcus. So the localization of the central sulcus is really important. And you all should leave this presentation have in mind how to localize the central sulcus. One way is to look at the pars opercularis and see what's behind it is the precentral gyrus. So obviously what's behind the precentral gyrus is the central sulcus. Anyway, let's go to the temporal lobe. In the temporal lobe, we have the superior temporal sulcus, inferior temporal sulcus. We mentioned at the end of the superior temporal sulcus, we have here in the parietal lobe. Anyone can tell what's here? What this area represents?
Angular gyrus.
Yes, excellent. The angular gyrus. So we have now two sulci and three gyri, the superior temporal gyrus, middle and inferior temporal gyrus. And the most anterior part of the temporal lobe, here demarcated in the pink area, this is the temporal pole. Pole, I mean the most prominent part at the extreme end of the surface of the brain. For example, here the temporal lobe. So we have the frontal pole, we have occipital pole, we have temporal pole, for example. One more specific thing I want you all to hear about is the ischial gyrus. Indeed, ischial gyrus is part of the temporal gyrus. It is just medial and superior. It's located medially and superiorly. Here's a coronal section of the brain. Here's the lateral ventricle. Here's the frontal lobe. Here's the temporal lobe. Here's the sylvian fissure. This is the insula over here, if we see it earlier. So this is the superior temporal gyrus, and this is the middle temporal gyrus. This is the ischial gyrus over here. It's more medial. If we retract the temporal operculum downward by retractor, we may visualize the ischial gyrus. Now let's move on to the occipital lobe. The occipital lobe located between the parieto-occipital sulcus. So as its name suggests, the parieto-occipital sulcus separates the parietal lobe above from the occipital lobe below. And we have the pre-occipital notch. This is a notch in the brain. As you can see here, this is the occipital lobe. As it comes here, it's going upward and then downward, some angulation. This is the pre-occipital notch. Here in the front, we have the temporal, behind we have the occipital lobe. We have the lateral occipital sulcus because it can be seen only on the lateral surface of the occipital lobe, so it's called the lateral occipital sulcus. The lateral occipital sulcus will divide the occipital lobe into superior occipital gyrus, inferior occipital gyrus, And we have some books mention that it is a middle or lateral occipital gyrus, here in the blue. Now, let's talk about the surface anatomy of the insula. We know where its location. It's located just deep to the opercula of the frontal parietal and the temporal. If we retract them, we will visualize the deep content of the Sylvian fissure. What's the floor here? Here's the insula. At the cortex, the fifth lobe, as we mentioned. So the surface anatomy of the insula, it has a sulcus surrounds the insula. It's called the circular sulcus. It's not circular in shape, indeed. It's oval in shape, but it circulates or encircles the insula, so it's called the circular sulcus. And it has a central sulcus, divide the insula into anterior and posterior parts. Anteriorly, we have 3 short gyri, and posteriorly, we have 2 long gyri. So the long gyri posteriorly and the short gyri anteriorly. And here in the posterior area, we have the limen insulae. This is the part, the limen insulae called. Now, after finishing the lateral cortex, the major surface landmarks, let's talk a few notes about the functional areas on that lateral cortex. We all know our most important landmark. We talked about the central sulcus and how we can localize exactly the central sulcus. One way we took earlier that this is the pars triangularis. This is the pars opercularis. Behind it, the precentral gyrus. Behind the precentral gyrus is the central sulcus. One more thing I want you to know now is the central sulcus usually doesn't continue to open into the Sylvian fissure. So it's not a blind end into the Sylvian fissure. It has this gyral bridge. This is the primary motor cortex, which is called the precentral gyrus, and behind the central sulcus, we have the postcentral gyrus, which is mainly somatosensory cortex. Well, these 2 gyri usually connects at the inferior margin of the central sulcus, which is called the gyral bridge. That's another landmark to localize the central sulcus. If we see the bridge, so it should be above the bridge. But that's not always there because some variation appear. This is, who can tell me what's this part of the brain is?
The orbital part of the frontal lobe.
Sorry about, not gyrus rectus.
Orbital part of frontal lobe.
Pars orbitalis. The orbital part of the frontal lobe is over here. That's most inferior surface. This is indeed a medial surface, pure medial. This is pars orbitalis. This is pars triangularis. This is pars. Okay. Opercularis. Now the functional areas, one more time, we have here the primary motor cortex. This is a primary somatosensory cortex. We have the Broca's area. You remember the Broca's area, the function is the motor speech area, and we have the Wernicke's area, which is a sensory speech area. So Broca's area located on the inferior frontal gyrus, over here between the pars triangularis and the opercularis, the Broca's area. And the Wernicke's area on the temporal lobe, posterior superior temporal area, it is a sensory area for speech. We have the occipital lobe. Its primary function is the primary visual cortex. And we have the auditory cortex here in the temporal lobe. This is a cadaveric view showing the cerebrum. This is right side. Right hemisphere, we can imagine here is the orbit, here is the eye, so this is the right side. What is the most prominent surface landmark I can identify? Anyone of you can help. What landmark attracts me? Yes, exactly. The Sylvian fissure or the lateral sulcus. It runs over here. Okay, so I identified this is the lateral surface. And here we can see this is the gyral bridge I mentioned earlier. So this should be the central sulcus. This is one way to identify the central sulcus quickly. What's in front of the central sulcus? Any sulcus in front of the central sulcus is the precentral sulcus. What's between them? Both of them, the precentral gyrus, the motor area. What's behind the central is the postcentral gyrus, which is mainly sensory area. And then we have, this is the Sylvian fissure with its posterior ramus going posteriorly and superiorly, ending in area of the parietal lobe called the supramarginal gyrus. And then we have, this is the superior temporal sulcus ending with the angular gyrus over here. We have here the inferior frontal sulcus, and the inferior frontal gyrus has three parts, pars opercularis, triangularis, and orbitalis. This is the superior temporal gyrus between the Sylvian fissure and above the superior temporal sulcus, middle temporal gyrus, and inferior temporal gyrus. One more view. This is the left hemisphere. This is the left air lobe. This is the left orbit over here. This is our friend, the Sylvian fissure. And here's the red arrow notes the gyral bridge. So this is the central sulcus, obviously. This is the Sylvian fissure. This is the inferior frontal sulcus over here. These are the three parts of the inferior frontal gyrus. Here in front of the central sulcus is the precentral gyrus. This is postcentral gyrus. Supramarginal and angular gyrus. Now we finished the lateral surface of the brain. Let's move on to the medial cortex. Let's take an overview, quick overview about the medial surface. First of all, we see the corpus callosum, which is the connection between the right and left hemisphere. It's a commissure for a bilateral connection. So the corpus callosum with its main 5 parts, we will discuss later on. What's above the corpus callosum is the sulcus of corpus callosum. So it's called the callosal sulcus, or sometimes it's called the pericallosal sulcus. And then this is the pink gyrus here. We have, it's called the cingulate gyrus, and it has its own sulcus, the cingulate sulcus. The cingulate sulcus has ascending ramus, which is called the marginal sulcus, that will show its head just from the medial side going to the lateral side. We saw it earlier on the lateral cortex. We told you that we will talk about it later on. So this is the marginal sulcus. It's a continuation of the cingulate sulcus. Then we have the parieto-occipital sulcus, most prominently on the medial surface, with something called the calcarine sulcus. They form the Y-shaped famous sulcus on the medial surface of the brain. So the parieto-occipital sulcus with the calcarine sulcus form the Y-shaped sulcus. They separate the precuneus from cuneus from lingula. We will talk about the details later on, but now just let's keep the concepts. This is the medial cortex here. The yellow area represents the superior frontal gyrus. Obviously, this is a frontal lobe. This is a superior frontal gyrus. So this is the cingulate gyrus, the pink one. This is the corpus callosum, and the blue area is the occipital lobe. The green area is the temporal lobe. And we will talk about the sulci of each lobe independently later on. Let's start from anteriorly. We have this area here. It's a part of the superior frontal gyrus. It represents the medial frontal gyrus. So it's sometimes called the medial frontal gyrus because we are seeing from the medial surface of the brain, and this is a frontal lobe. This is a superior frontal gyrus. So it's called the medial frontal gyrus. Here we have the paracentral lobule. It starts from the marginal gyrus posteriorly to the paracentral sulcus anteriorly. And here we have, this is the central sulcus. Our friend, the central sulcus, is the important target of our presentation today to localize on many views, one of which is the medial view. So if we can see the marginal sulcus, just anterior to the marginal sulcus, we can identify the central sulcus. Okay, so this is the paracentral lobule. Now, this is the corpus callosum over here. This is called the rostrum of corpus callosum, then genu, then body, then isthmus, and splenium. So the rostrum, just beneath the rostrum, we have the rostral gyrus. So it takes its name in relation to that part of the corpus callosum, rostral gyrus. And now we have here the gyrus rectus. It's a straight gyrus, most medial and inferior part from the frontal lobe. Now we have moved on from the frontal lobe to the parietal lobe. This area is named precuneus. And here we have the parieto-occipital sulcus, and then we have this area which is called the cuneus. So we have cuneus, precuneus, and the parieto-occipital sulcus separates both of them. So the precuneus is the parietal lobe, and the cuneus is the occipital lobe. And we have the calcarine sulcus unite with the parieto-occipital sulcus to form this Y-shaped sulcus. And the calcarine sulcus separates the cuneus from the lingual gyrus, both of which in the occipital lobe. Now let's move on to the temporal lobe. In the temporal lobe, starting medially, we have the parahippocampal gyrus. This is the purple one. And then we have the occipitotemporal gyrus, or sometimes called the fusiform gyrus. And we have the inferior frontal gyrus, sometimes can be visualized from the inferior surface. It can be visualized from the inferior surface indeed. What separates the parahippocampal gyrus from the occipitotemporal gyrus is the collateral sulcus. So this sulcus over here is called the collateral sulcus. And then what separates the occipitotemporal gyrus from the inferior temporal gyrus is the occipitotemporal sulcus. You have to keep this in mind. And then we have, this is the temporal pole. Now, this is a medial surface of the right hemisphere, showing the corpus callosum with its 5 main parts. Here is the genu, here's the rostrum, genu, body, isthmus, and the splenium. These are the 5 parts of the corpus callosum. Anyone can identify this structure?
Cingulate.
What's this?
Cingulate sulcus.
Yes, exactly. This is the cingulate sulcus. Excellent. Now, this is a cadaveric view. This is the left hemisphere, as we can imagine. We are seeing the corpus callosum. This is the rostral part of the corpus callosum. What's around the corpus callosum is the cingulate gyrus. What's around it, the cingulate sulcus, with its ascending ramus, or called the marginal sulcus. And then we have, this is our friend, the Y-shaped sulcus. This is parieto-occipital part, and the calcarine sulcus unite and separate cuneus from lingula, and the cuneus from the precuneus by the parieto-occipital sulcus. Now, after finishing the lateral and the medial cortex surface anatomy, we finished a big bulk of this presentation, or this concept of the surface anatomy. Now we will see the inferior cortex, which we saw most of it in the medial surface, but we will add a few more things. So here is the inferior surface of the brain. Here is the frontal lobes, and here is the midbrain, or the brainstem, and this is the temporal lobes. This is the frontal lobe. This is the right. This is the left. The left is being retracted laterally. So the area in the green represent the gyrus rectus, or the straight gyrus. You can see how it goes straight, like it's a purely demarcated gyrus. This is gyrus rectus. What's lateral to it, we have the olfactory sulcus. It has the olfactory tract running into it. Lateral to it, we have the orbital gyrus. So this is the orbital gyrus. You should differentiate between the orbital gyrus and the pars orbitalis, part of the inferior frontal gyrus. They are not the same. This is the orbital gyrus. On the inferior surface of the frontal lobe, here we have the orbit, if you can imagine. And in the orbital gyrus, we have sulci. This is the orbital sulci. The orbital sulci divide the orbital gyrus into anterior, posterior, medial, and lateral orbital gyri. And then in the temporal lobe, we have the parahippocampal gyrus over here, separated from the occipitotemporal gyrus by the collateral sulcus. So this is the collateral sulcus. This is the most medial gyrus, is the parahippocampal. And then we have the occipitotemporal gyrus, or the fusiform gyrus, with its different parts. I'm not going to mention it right now. And then we have, just lateral to it, we have the occipitotemporal sulcus, separating it from the occipitotemporal gyrus from the inferior temporal gyrus. And here, lateral to it, we have the inferior temporal sulcus. And then we have this prominent part on the medial surface of the temporal lobe, the uncus, which is really in close proximity to the brainstem. And it has a clinical significance in brain herniation. If you heard of uncal herniation, for example, the uncus can be pushed medially and put pressure on the brainstem and may cause death. Now let's see a few radiological images about this anatomy of the surface of the cerebrum. This is a T2 weighted imaging, MRI. This is a sagittal section imaging. How I know this is a T2, because we can see the CSF filled spaces or sulci are colored in white. So it is a T2. Number one is the central sulcus. Number two is the sylvian fissure. This is the frontal lobe. Okay, this is the temporal lobe over here. This is the central sulcus. This is sylvian fissure. Number three. Anyone can guess what is number three is? What is this sulci?
Central sulcus.
Post center.
Not exactly.
Marginal sulcus.
This is the marginal sulcus. Continues from the cingulate sulcus and then goes from the medial surface to the lateral. This is the marginal sulcus. Okay, number four. Anyone can guess what's number four? This is also medial surface.
Sulcus.
Yes, exactly, the calcarine sulcus. And this is the corpus callosum, the pericallosal sulcus, etc. Here is an axial section imaging. This is a T2 weighted imaging MRI also. Here we have, this is the orbital gyrus with its orbital sulci in the white. And here we have the uncus part of the temporal lobe. As I mentioned previously 2 times, I think, the central sulcus is really important to localize. One more radiological sign to localize the central sulcus is called the omega sign. The omega sign is just like this, just like that, just like the omega sign in mathematics or physics, I don't know. This is the omega sign. It represents the central sulcus. What's in front of it is the precentral gyrus. What's behind it is the postcentral gyrus. So if a lesion we have here, it's mostly affecting the motor function, while if a lesion is here, it's mostly affecting the sensory function. Now let's see the superior cortex. This is the right, this is the left, this is anterior, and this is posterior. This is the longitudinal fissure. And here we have, this is the superior frontal gyrus. This is the superior frontal sulcus over here, and here, this is the superior frontal sulcus. And here we have, this is the middle frontal gyrus here, and this is the middle frontal gyrus here also. So anyone can tell me which one is the central sulcus? This one, or this one, or this one? Yani this one, or this one, or this one, and why? Let's imagine this is number 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. Which one do you think is the central sulcus? And how did you know?
Is the central sulcus.
Number
Because
2,
of
this?
the omega sign.
This one?
Yeah.
This is a gyrus,
Yeah.
indeed, not a sulcus, sorry.
No, above it.
You mean number 5? Number 5, it's also above it,
Yeah.
from the other side. How did you know it?
Because of the omega sign.
Well, let's see. Okay. Since this is the superior frontal gyrus, this is the middle frontal gyrus, and here is the superior frontal sulcus. The sulcus behind the superior frontal sulcus is the precentral sulcus. So this sulcus is the precentral sulcus. As you can see, it's a T sign, sometimes called on radiology. This is the head of the T, and this is the body of the T. T sign, the superior frontal sulcus with the precentral sulcus. So what's behind the precentral sulcus is the precentral gyrus. What's behind it? This is the central sulcus indeed. So it's not 5. Okay, this is another way to reach to the central sulcus by knowing the superior frontal sulcus with the precentral sulcus making the T sign. Or another sign we will talk about in radiology, the L sign, which is the superior frontal gyrus. This is the superior frontal gyrus making L sign with the precentral gyrus. So what gyrus or what sulcus behind this L sign is the central sulcus. We'll talk about it in a minute also. So this should be the central sulcus. This is the postcentral area. This is the precentral sulcus. Here is the central sulcus, and this is the postcentral. Here is a sagittal section, MRI, T1 weighted imaging. As we can see, the CSF is black. Here we have the corpus callosum, the cingulate gyrus, and the cingulate sulcus. With here in the red, the marginal sulcus. Here are the 5 parts of the corpus callosum: the rostrum, genu, body, isthmus, and splenium. Here are the radiological signs we can see identify the central sulcus, one of which is the omega sign, which is obvious over here. So this is the omega sign. The other sign we mentioned earlier is the T sign, which is the connection of the superior temporal sulcus with the precentral sulcus, forming the T sign. What's behind it is the precentral gyrus, so it's a motor function. Or the L sign, which is the superior frontal gyrus with the precentral gyrus, forming an L sign. So this is also indication of this is the central sulcus. And this is the red part. It is shown bilaterally on the medial surface, coming superiorly and a little bit laterally. This is the marginal sulcus, which is a continuation of the cingulate sulcus. This is another picture. This is the right side. This is the left side. This is the superior frontal gyrus. This is the precentral gyrus. So this is the L sign. What's behind it is the central sulcus. This is a coronal section imaging, T2 weighted imaging. The CSF is bright white. And here, this is the coronal section, as I mentioned. This is the superior frontal gyrus. This is the superior frontal sulcus. This one is the middle frontal gyrus. This is the inferior frontal sulcus. This is the inferior frontal gyrus. Then we finished the frontal lobe. This is the Sylvian fissure. You can imagine how anatomy is correlated with radiology and with the 3D imaginations. It's really an important concept, especially in neurosurgery, to have a 3D imagination. So you have to see the brain from different sides, lateral, medial, superior, inferior, coronal, axial, sagittal, and then correlate it with radiology and try to build a 3D image in your mind. Okay, this is the Sylvian fissure. And here is the insula, the 5th lobe of the brain we mentioned at the beginning of our presentation. And here behind, or I mean below the Sylvian fissure is the temporal lobe. This is the superior temporal gyrus. This is the superior temporal sulcus. And here is the middle temporal gyrus. Anyone can tell what is this? It's really hard to be recognized, but can you remember the inferior surface of the brain, of the temporal lobe? What is this?
Lateral sulcus.
It separates what from what? Which gyri?
البارahippocampal عند Occipitotemporal.
Excellent. Excellent, Parker. This is the parahippocampal gyrus, separating it from the Occipitotemporal gyrus. Now, I finished this part of my presentation. Now, test yourself with one question. I need one volunteer of you to share his knowledge with us and tell me where is the lesion, or if the best to be done is to describe this radiology for me. Anyone, please.
Is the lesion in the precentral gyrus?
How did you know that?
I firstly identified the central sulcus and it's in front of it.
So this is the lesion, you mean?
Yeah.
And this is the central sulcus in front of it, or what?
No. The central sulcus is posterior to the lesion.
Can you see it? This one?
I can see it. I can see it on the other side. The lesion makes it unclear.
Exactly. So this is the central, or this, or this? Number 1 or 2 or 3? Which one do you think?
Number 2.
Excellent.
Number 2.
How did you know it? Yani, did you
The
just
omega
guess
sign
it?
can help.
Excellent. No. Yes, this is the omega sign. So this is the central sulcus. In front of it, the precentral gyrus. So what do you think the sequelae of this lesion? Is it compromising the motor or the sensory function, if it has any sequelae, indeed? Just
motor,
to correlate it.
Of the,
yes.
Of the motor, because of the precentral gyrus.
Excellent. Now, let's recap what we take from the beginning of this presentation with a 1.5 minute video. I'll leave you with it, and then we will receive your questions. Okay, now, after this recap, if we have any question, please don't hesitate to ask me. I can hear you. We can discuss anything in mind about this topic. Yes, please, anyone? Anything in mind? Ahmed Khalil raised hand. Yes, please.
Hi, hello, doctor.
Hi.
Thanks for this lecture. And I have one question. I don't understand what are you meaning by the omega sign and how I recognize the central sulcus by the omega sign.
Okay, it's really good question. The omega sign, it's a imaginary sign indeed. Let's get back to the radiology. See here. Here, the omega sign, let's see, it's this one. This is the real omega sign in mathematics or physics, I don't know. It's shaped like this. So we have something in the brain that has a CSF filled space. This is a sulci. It looks like the omega sign. This one. Can you relate this one to this one? This is the left one. This is the right side. So this is the omega sign. It represents the central sulcus. Everything in front of it is the precentral gyrus. Whatever behind it is the postcentral gyrus. Clear? And I didn't mention, I think, this is a motor function of the
gyrus or any place other.
Well, in front of it.
Hello?
Yes, I can hear you. In front of it is the precentral gyrus, yes. And behind it is the postcentral gyrus.
So, thanks.
Is that clear?
Thanks.
Welcome. Yeah. I don't think if I mentioned that what is the anatomical significance of this omega sign. Well, I read it one time. It represents the thumb area representation of the motor homunculus on the cortex. So it represents the hand area and that part of the cortex. Yes, please. Any other questions? Well, if you have any question anytime, please don't hesitate. Thank you all. And now I'll stop sharing and then we'll see our colleagues.